Hi, I'm Steve Maccabee and welcome to the P-Pod. Just a quick note before we get started. This episode contains safeguarding topics that some listeners might find tricky and it's not suitable for children. Please also be aware that everything we share was accurate at the time of recording, but guidance and services do change, so do make sure you're checking out the latest information. Now, if this episode sparks your thinking, share it with your team, start a conversation, and don't forget to follow the P-Pod so you never miss an episode. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the P-Pod.
Right then, welcome back to us once again at the P-Pod, the partnership podcast from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. And I am so pleased today to invite back friend of the P-Pod, seasoned veteran now, and friend of the show, Sally Shearer OBE from the National Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. Sally, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you guys are incredibly busy at the moment and got loads going on, which if you don't mind, we'll get into in just a second. But how are you? How are you keeping?
Yes, I'm fine, thanks, Steve. And thanks very much for inviting me back to the P-Pod. It's always great to have opportunities to share our learning and get our key messages out. So thank you.
No, thank you. We generally really appreciate it. Because I know you, both yourself and the national panel as a whole are very busy these days. But the reason we wanted to get you back here is because for anybody that's not aware, recently the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel, which if you want to find out more, come and listen back to some of the previous episodes we've done with Sally, where we talk about the role of the panel. And part of the role of the panel is conducting national child safeguarding practice reviews on occasions. And the previous one was the national review following the deaths of Star Hobson and Arthur Hughes. Both children died during the COVID lockdown period. But more recently, have just completed and published their last report, Protecting All Vulnerable Babies Better, which was just published in February of this year in 2026. Now, if anybody is not aware of that review, that's the aim of today's episode, is really to give you that oversight in terms of what it is. But as a very, very sort of broad capture, this was really came about, sadly, the death of baby Victoria Martin, who died very early in 2023. And this was following both of her parents seeking to evade professionals, having had 4 previous children removed from their care, which at the time did lead to a very high level of media coverage. So that was the initial focus of the panel. But as we'll hear from Sally, actually, I think the review has taken on a much broader scope, thinking about protecting all vulnerable babies. So that's what we're going to get into today. And let's say we're so pleased to have Sally come and join us for this from the panel to really kind of talk through the details. But Sally, before we do get into the review, I know the national panel, like I mentioned, has been very busy recently. Could you just tell us, what have you guys been up to recently?
Thanks, Steve. Yes, it has been a really busy period for us. I think listeners will be aware that we had a new chair. So David Holmes joined us last June now. And also we've had 4 new panel members because we are all on fixed term periods of office and some of our colleagues needed to move on. So there's been a lot of work going on also. Listeners will be aware of the government's intention to look at setting up a child protection authority. So I suppose as a forerunner to that, the panel has been testing out some things that may be really helpful, both to practitioners, but also to having that oversight and making sure that children across the country are well protected and that they have their health, safety and well-being looked after. So some of that work focuses on improving our data analysis so that we can understand more the issues that are impacting upon current day practice. And then some of the focus has also been on reviewing how we get messages out to safeguarding partnerships. We have an awful lot of data coming in through our rapid reviews and local child safeguarding practice reviews. So how we analyse all of that information and then package it in a format that is really useful to practitioners and really makes a difference to how they can make sure that children are protected. So a key sort of cornerstone of all of that, that's with the launch of our new website. We're all very excited about that. People will know that historically, if you wanted to access any of our national reviews that you've just mentioned, you would have to go on the gov.uk website, but the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel now has from tomorrow, has its very own facility. And we're starting that off with 4 key areas. I hope I can remember them all. So there's vulnerable babies, there's a section on neglect, a section on race, culture, ethnicity, and there's also a section on child sexual abuse, reflecting our last national review. I wanted them all to notice about intrafamilial child sexual abuse. So within the website, there will be some briefing papers that we have prepared. There will be some PowerPoint slides that if safeguarding teams want to be able to do some training themselves, they've got some ready-made slides on our work and our statistics and what we know so that they can just pick them up off the shelf and run with them. But I suppose the key difference is as we get up and running, we will be wanting to make this much more collaborative. So if as a safeguarding partnership, you've developed a really good tool or you've put a really good system in place. So for example, this week I met with a partnership who's put a brilliant system in around pre-birth assessment. We will probably in our letter back to you on that rapid review be saying, oh, well done, this is really good, we'd like to share this wider. Can we work with you to put something on our website? And then we've got some more subjects that are coming online. So I'm currently working on missing the protective factor of education, particularly around children who are missing education or those who are electively home educated. So there will be new subjects coming online all of the time, but also the subjects that we have got will be growing. So we hope safeguarding practitioners find that really helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sam. Really exciting, I think. And I know previously we've talked about, in a way, what a sort of privileged position the national panel has of having that real oversight of all the themes, but also all the good practice from right the way across the country. And I know you've talked previously, and I know when David came into post as chair, he was really keen to say, we've got to communicate this. We've got to have an ability to learn from each other. And so I think the website is really exciting. I think it's a really exciting development, and it'll be great to see that grow and evolve over time as sort of more and more good practice is shared, because there is some really good practice that takes place out there. But unless you're actively seeking it, how is somebody in Somerset here supposed to know that Liverpool, for example, have got a fantastic program running on this or some amazing resources on that? So yeah, it's so great to be able to have a conduit from the national panel to be able to sort of pull all of that together. So if it's okay, we will link to the new website in the description for the episode. So yeah, do check that out once you have listened to this. But pulling us back to our focus for today, if we can, like I mentioned, obviously just a couple of months ago now, you've published the latest National Child Safeguarding Practice Review, Protecting All Vulnerable Babies Better. And I know that you had quite a key role to play in that review. So for anybody who's not had a chance to read the full review yet, what want most professionals to come across all agencies to understand actually why it was conducted in the first place and why it matters, why we're kind of looking at this as a topic.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So you've already given a very good grounding at the start into Victoria's story. I think what we didn't want to do within this national review was to revisit any of that information that had been shared in the media during the 2 criminal trials. So it wasn't particularly looking back. It's about looking forward. And okay, so this has happened. What can we learn from it? And in particular, what issues does Victoria's short story raise, because they are issues that come up time and time again when we talk to safeguarding partnerships. So the other thing that we looked at when we did this was the national data. And we realised that last year there were 5,000 unborn babies and babies under the age of 1 who were on child protection plans. And when we look at our own serious incident notification data, we know that 36% of notifications that come into the panel are for babies under 1 or unborn babies. And that's been a figure that has been consistent since the panel was established in 2018. Also, when we look at the children who have died in notifications to the panel, we know that 33% of deaths notified to the panel are for babies under 1. And therefore, I think that flagged to the panel just how very vulnerable these babies are and that we needed to have a particular spotlight upon them. So it wasn't so much to look at what happened to Victoria, but to think about how we can improve keeping babies safe, particularly around families who don't engage, families who move area quite frequently, concealed pregnancy, and also domestic abuse.
When you look at the data, we continue to see that harm to very, very young babies. And I know certainly during the COVID lockdown periods, we saw that real spike in sort of harm to very young babies. We also, coming out from that, again, hopefully people are aware, but we had things like the National Panel's report. I wanted Myth of Invisible Men. Slipped my memory there for a minute here. And the fieldwork report that came out following that. So you're right, we do sadly see this real vulnerability. And as I always point out to people, when we think about particularly the youngest babies, particularly those under ones, the highest level of vulnerability of any age group, the highest level of dependency on adults for their care, and the lowest amount of routine service involvement with those children. And I know in the last annual report from the National Panel, obviously, again, harm to babies was highlighted in that. So I think it's really interesting to see this being picked up specifically around this area. And I think you're right. And I think the point I wanted to stress as well to anybody listening to this, I think at the time of Victoria's sad death, there was a huge amount of media coverage from this one. And I think it's very shrewd of the National Panel to say, well, actually, potentially this could be quite salacious of kind of building on that. But actually it's so, so important. We don't just focus on those really tragic circumstances for Victoria, because sadly, as we've just been saying, she's not the only child who is experiencing these risks here. And this learning isn't just about one family. So I guess from that, what patterns did you see from undertaking this review that will sadly feel quite familiar to a lot of practitioners listening to this?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And the issues that Victoria's story raised are issues that we know impact upon practitioners every single day. And they centre really around 4 key themes. So the first one is around families who move location very rapidly. And we know that very often families fall upon very difficult circumstances. They're moving in with different family members. But sometimes families move around a lot with the intention of evading the scrutiny of professional services. And where you obviously get all of those moves, there are potential gaps in knowledge, understanding, handover processes. And this is a very key theme for the panel, not just with babies, but across all age groups. The second issue that was raised was around the concealment of pregnancy, because obviously nobody knew that Victoria even existed until that very final moment when the police were looking for her and she'd actually been born. And I think the reasons why people conceal pregnancy are incredibly complex. But we were really fortunate that Victoria's mother herself did contribute some written responses to questions that we posed to her. And she describes in there that desire to keep a baby when you've had child after child after child removed from you was so overwhelming that is very often a reason why people conceal pregnancy, and is a trauma response to the terrible grief that they have suffered from those removals. The third issue that it raised, and we absolutely know that this is something that practitioners from all agencies really struggle with, is those families who are really difficult for agencies to be able to make contact with, to develop relationships with on a consistent basis so that they can offer support and also undertake their risk assessments. And there had been a very, very long history of this couple not engaging. Even before Victoria's eldest sibling had been born, Victoria's father was not fully engaging with the probation services. And then you've got 5 pregnancies, and again, over about a 5 or 6 year period, a very long history of non-engagement with safeguarding services, and moving into this cycle of removal and a further pregnancy. And then I suppose the final theme was around domestic abuse. And it can be really difficult for practitioners to understand what is happening within a home. It was very difficult with Victoria's parents. They consistently denied domestic abuse. They were very economical with any information that they shared with agencies. And that, again, is something that's seen across many rapid reviews, making it really hard for practitioners to understand the level of risk and think about interventions that they can put in place to support the family. So those 4 issues are the issues that we know practitioners struggle with every day, and we hope, therefore, that this is helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sally. And like I say, it is, understandably, all of those points I think you've raised are real challenges for every day. I'm sure people listening to this will be thinking, I know a family, or I've worked with a family where we face those challenges there, whether or not we're referring to families with very young babies or unborn babies or with older children. There will be some families that are difficult to engage with. And actually, it's so important to think about that wider context. And I think what was interesting with this review is it does pick up very strongly, I think, in that kind of national move that we're seeing from all these things you've just been talking about. When we look at the changes to working together, and we look at the Families First partnership program, and I think it picks up on all of those kind of points about making sure we've got that family-led practice in what we're doing, and really trying to properly understand why these things may be, rather than just that they're not engaging, or why are not they're not engaging. And I think just picking up on that first theme around non-engagement, and you're right, it comes up time and time again in that review. And from the panel's perspective, what do you feel the professionals often misunderstand about families who don't engage?
I think when we were undertaking the review, and we were really well supported by the safeguarding partnerships that had been involved in Victoria's care and the care of her siblings, obviously, to a greater extent. And I think what practitioners really struggled with was you'd got a couple who, when faced with having their children removed, one after the other, they chose not to engage with agencies and to give up their child rather than to engage and be able to keep their child. And that doesn't make sense, does it? They really struggled to be able to understand that. So I think the first thing is that families don't engage just out of principle and, well, we're not going to engage with them. It's very often a much more complex trauma response, perhaps rooted in their own childhood experiences, perhaps rooted in having children removed and the incredible grief that they are left with, very often unsupported with that grief. So it's very much about getting underneath previous experiences, current experience, and understanding what trauma response is driving the behaviours that you see now. So there's a really poignant quote from Victoria's mother that really stopped me in my tracks, and that was asking practitioners to think about what it feels like to visit your children in a contact centre and then walk away and leave them there with other people. And so I think not underestimating the incredible impact that will have had on parents, and thinking about how that then drives their behaviour.
I think it's really good to hear that she did contribute to this review, because obviously it's something that we always try and strive for, whether that's local child safeguarding practice reviews or national. And sadly, quite often it doesn't happen. But I think getting that insight from a parent involved in these things could be so crucial, isn't it? And I think it's right. I think you'd often hear, thankfully not so much now, but you'd hear phrases like disguised compliance. And I think there's a lovely quote I always used to say from Donald Forrester around disguised compliance. And essentially, when we apply that label, we put the responsibility onto the parent to change, rather than thinking about, actually, do we need to do something different here? Are we getting this right? Or do we need to change our approach in this? And I think it's something I've always really strongly held on to. And I think you're right. It would be very easy to say they're not complying with services, they're not engaging, they're not being honest with always at times. But actually, if you look at that, the context of actually how that feels to them, and I think that sort of quote is really important. Actually, how would it feel having one of your children and visiting them, having that joy, and then having to walk away, and sort of quite often having that analogy of walking away and then sitting in a quiet room and with that emptiness and sitting within that emptiness. It must be really, really difficult. So when you start understanding that better, actually you can start understanding sort of why we might see some of these behaviours, rather than just they're not engaging.
Yeah.
Actually trying to understand why not. And I think picking up on that, and you mentioned trauma-informed and trauma-informed practice, and it's a phrase that we hear a lot. Obviously, we've been doing a lot locally around trauma-informed practice and right the way across the country. And it is a phrase that you hear time and time again. And I think there's a risk with these things. It becomes a bit of a buzzword. It doesn't actually, it loses its kind of meaning. But I'm based on this review, using this review as an example to talk about trauma-informed safeguarding. And what does that actually look like in practice, particularly where you've got risks that might be particularly high?
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the buzzword, actually, because we did reference a research in practice document within the review, which shows that even between individual teams, services, sat in agencies, sat in safeguarding partnerships, what trauma means and what a trauma-informed response means different things to different people. And that's why we've made both a national and a local recommendation. There is a government definition on trauma-informed practice. So we would suggest that, first of all, safeguarding partnerships do some work to think about what that means to them and what training, therefore, that their practitioners need to be able to understand all of those events that have contributed to their current presentation and how best that they can help. So that's a bit of an umbrella on trauma. But then within that, we started to think about what does this look like? Because obviously, in order to be able to support a family, protect the well-being of the children, you have absolutely got to have that engaging relationship with the family. So first of all, I think there's something about safety within a team, within an agency, and within a partnership about having that physical, emotional, and psychological safety so that service users feel able, as you say, to engage with agencies. That might be practical things, opening hours, where you meet, but also it is very much around how it feels to be working within that agency. And part of that is having really transparent processes, transparent ways of working to build that trust. And you don't build trust in 5 minutes, do you? It's something that needs to be consistently applied so that families feel able to trust the people that they're working with and that they feel that they've got some control over their own destiny, that they're able to participate in shared decision making about what happens to their children. And then really important thinking about cultural considerations, moving away from stereotypes and biases, and thinking as an individual, as a team, as a service, as an agency, and as a safeguarding partnership, what needs to happen to be able to meet parents where they are at the moment. And there are numerous resources that we've referenced within the report for people to have a look at.
It's easy for people to listen to this, go, oh, there's something new, we've got to do something else, we've got to do, but it's all working in the same direction. I think the direction of travel nationally, with working together with the Families First program, with everything else, it's all working in that same direction. And I think it's so, I'll be honest, in terms of trauma-informed practice, it's only sort of fairly recently, over the last few years or so, it's sort of really come up on my radar and many people's radars nationally. And it is challenging, I think, sometimes to genuinely think about what does that actually mean for me as an individual, for me as part of the team, for me as part of a service. And like you mentioned earlier, that might look different for different teams, different services. But actually, what does that actually look like when I am engaging and working with families and that family-led practice as well? And I think particularly where there is risk identified or particularly high risk identified, I think it can be easier sometimes for professionals to say, well, I need to take full control of this and I need to lead this and understandably, but how do we still keep that trauma-informed approach and that family-led practice? And there are some amazing examples of this. And again, for anybody listening to this, if you go back to one of our PPOD episodes around motivational interviewing, for example, we've had consultant social worker Sharon who talks about how she's used that trauma-led practice and motivational interviewing in some really difficult situations. And Sally, you won't be aware of this, but one of those was where she had to remove a baby at birth from the mother from the hospital. And incredibly traumatic experience. But she talks through about actually how she used her skills and her experience to have that trauma-informed approach, talk to the mother to say, look, I understand right now this feels very, very unsafe to you and it feels very scary and you don't feel in control. You don't know what's happening. This is what we need to do and this is why we need to do this. But our aim is to make sure we can make sure that you can be with your baby and that will be safe. And we need to work together to make that happen. And cutting a very long story short, went from what was a very, very heightened experience with police there and to actually getting to the point where the mother, it was still very difficult, but where the mother handed over the baby willingly and really engaged and really worked with services moving forward. But you can see, unless it had that trauma-informed approach, you could very easily be in a situation where that baby is forcibly removed, taken away, parents get well away because of that risk. And ultimately, I think picking up from what you were talking about right at the beginning there, then we're into this cycle of loss for parents and the impact on the child throughout their life as well. So the more we can do to be open, transparent, working with families while still keeping that focus on keeping children safe is so crucial, I think. And there are some really good examples of that. And sometimes it can feel a little bit unachievable, but it's certainly not. I think it's a culture shift and it's a mindset shift about how we actually go about doing what we do, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to pick up on is obviously we're talking about Victoria and other babies here, but obviously the review places a really strong emphasis on unborn babies and putting in those safeguarding measures prior to a baby being born in the first place. So what do you feel needs to shift from the review in how professionals think about safeguarding before that baby is born rather than sort of responding or reacting after the birth?
Yeah, thanks. So we thought a lot about pre-birth planning within the review, and obviously that can be quite difficult if you don't know that there is a pregnancy. So I would say even before that, there needs to be some thought at the point of removal. Is this woman going to get pregnant again? We spoke to some really senior practitioners in national roles and also the luxury of talking to some mothers who had some children removed. And I think the overwhelming message at removal is that people just want their baby back or want to have a baby. And so whilst I think there is a quote in the review that whilst Victoria's death wasn't predictable, her birth certainly was. So there's something about that curiosity at the point of removal. What do we need to wrap around these parents now at this point to move them into a better place so that they can, if they decide to embark on another pregnancy, be in a better position to keep that baby? But assuming that you do know about the pregnancy, pre-birth planning is really important. And we found the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory document Born into Care offers some really well-grounded and sensible advice into what pre-birth planning would look like. And we also asked, when I did a search on Working Together 23 to see how often the word unborn was used, it's used twice in the whole 2023 document. And so we're really grateful to the Working Together team for expanding upon that in Working Together 26. And we will continue to work with them on that. But what we know from pre-birth planning is that most safeguarding partnerships have a multi-agency pre-birth protocol. But what we know from our rapid reviews is that the level and the consistency to which those pre-birth protocols are adhered to varies hugely. So it's really important that safeguarding partnerships audit where they are around compliance against pre-birth planning. So I think really important to have that plan in place, to work with other agencies. It's not a single agency issue, is it, pre-birth planning? And to be really open and transparent with families. Like you say, this is what we need to do. This is why we need to do it. And then we need to think about how you can have contact with your baby safely and how we can work towards you having your baby back. So I think those are the key principles around pre-birth planning.
No, thank you. And I guess also just something else I wanted to pick up on is that one of those themes that you mentioned earlier is around in that pre-birth period that concealed or late disclosed pregnancies. And again, it is a real challenging area. But I guess again, some of that sort of learning from this review of what should professionals be more curious about or alert about when you're working with parents like you've been talking about that have had children removed previously, and some of those things they've got to have at the forefront of their mind, even if they're not aware that there is another pregnancy.
It's really difficult, isn't it, to understand whether somebody is planning a pregnancy or going to embark on a pregnancy where concealment is an issue because you don't know what you don't know. So it is really important for practitioners to think about that at the point of removal. It's a discussion that we now have in panel. When we're reading rapid reviews and a baby, a toddler has been removed, and our letters now back to partnerships, we're saying, what are you thinking about around working with that family post-removal? Because you can't track and keep tabs on everybody, but what you can do is you can offer support to those families to enable them to move into a good place so that any future pregnancies, that they're more likely to be able to keep that baby.
I know there are some really good programs that are running nationally as well. I'm thinking about like the Pause program, which aims to work with women who have had repeat pregnancies and repeat sort of cycles of children being removed. So I think there are specific programs like that. But I think the point you make about we need to be working with all parents who have had children removed, because it will have understandably a huge impact on them. And there will be that huge sense of loss. And like I said, we can't predict that, yes, okay, that somebody will go on to have another baby, for example, if a baby's been removed. But using that learning, the evidence, the research, which says actually, again, taking that trauma-informed approach, actually this will have an impact on the parent. And this may then result in another baby, another pregnancy to fulfill that sense of loss. So it's something we need to be aware of and working proactively, as you've been talking about, to think, okay, well, the child is being removed. So we do need to put that bit of work in. And I think what we've traditionally seen quite often, because there's understandably such a focus on the child, at the point that the baby, well, any child is removed, there's a huge, massive focus on that child, rightly so. But parents are often then left in this sense of limbo, of loss. Again, sitting in the quiet room is the analogy I always use, silent room by yourself. And we've got to understand that, and we've got to put some work in there to work to prevent that cycle. And exactly as you've been saying, ultimately, the aim would be, as long as it's safe to do so, to be looking to focus on reuniting that child with their parent as safely and as effectively as possible. But we've got to put that work in at that point in time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did look at Pause and other types of programs within the review. I think when we write a review, we try and be realistic about what safeguarding partnerships are going to be able to implement. And some of those programs do require quite a lot of resource. And where you're funneling resource into one particular issue, it's obviously drawing funds away from others, which is why we decided to make the recommendation that local safeguarding partnerships should sit down with all of the colleagues, all of the agencies, including the voluntary sector that they work with, map out what services they've got available to them and map out whether there are any gaps, and then think about, at that point of removal, what from that whole portfolio of services that sits within that partnership can you select and really tailor an approach to support and assist those parents. And we were told quite clearly within the review that at the point of removal, parents don't necessarily want therapeutic intervention. They may be struggling, as we know, with many of these families. They're facing multiple challenges, not just one. They may not have anywhere to live, they may be suffering financially, they might have mental health or substance misuse issues, and therefore they almost need help to get to the bottom rung of the ladder. They are so far away from that therapeutic starting point. So that thinking about what they need, and you make a really good point about at the point of removal, all of the focus, all of the attention, all of the follow-up follows the child. And that's quite right, isn't it? Those children absolutely need everything that's available to them. But sitting in that empty room, absolutely, we identified that as an issue. And if you lose a baby or a child because of a bereavement, there are a multitude of services that can wrap around you and support you. But if you lose a baby to care, that empathy, the shame associated with it, it's equally as heartbreaking for those families, and yet there's a dearth of attention and focus. Particularly, a lot of these families don't have family support either. It's very variable what levels of friend and family support that couples have. So really thinking about what do this couple need to help them at this time.
Thanks. And that's a really interesting point you make there, Sally, I think. And you're right. It's as we view things as society, I think, and we can have sympathy, we can have empathy for people that have lost babies, and suffered bereavements, miscarriages during pregnancy, and put that support in. But we quite often will see it quite differently if a child is removed and not recognising the impact of that still. So I think that's a really important parallel to bring in. I think the other thing I wanted to pick up on today, if it's all right, was around a theme that actually came out again, talking about the last published annual report from the national panel. It was a theme that came out in that and comes out in this review as well, is the importance around adult services and children's services needing to work much closer together and much more joined up in their working. And I know in the national panel's last annual report, it was very much thinking about things like adult mental health services or adult social care, working very closely with children's social care, for example. So where do you think the system still falls down around this? And when we talk about sort of doing it well, what would that actually look like, do you think?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Steve. This is a perennial problem, hasn't it? It's been around for a very long time, and we see it consistently and persistently through our rapid reviews. There's absolutely something about agencies, individuals who are working with adults. They might be in mental health services, it might be in the GP surgery, and they know that this person has got children that they're responsible for, and yet there's a failure to consider what the impact of their presenting problem might be on their parenting capacity. And similarly, children's social care may be working with a family, perhaps not aware of all the agencies that are involved. So really important to have that two-way discussion. And I think the other thing that the review brought into focus was around offender management agencies and the absolutely key role that they can play, but the fact that very often they're overlooked when it comes to multi-agency child protection. And thinking about, for example, if somebody is under probation or other offender services, that probation might not always know that this person has got parent or caring responsibilities or even has any access to children at all. And something that came up in the round tables was very often offenders don't tell their probation officer or whoever, their key worker, that they've entered into a new relationship or that for some reason there are now some children in their life. So it's really important more than ever that agencies work together and really understand who's in a family, who's having access to children, and then drawing all of that information in. Offender management, they've got some really specialist expertise that I think you'll see in the review. We really recommend that within multi-agency child protection teams, that agencies do have access to offender management expertise within that multi-agency child protection team, because they can offer some really not only information about the individual, but some real insight into risk assessment. And then I suppose the other thing around children and adult services working together, we've already touched upon, which is where you're looking at what support you're going to put into a family post-removal, that you're not just thinking immediately what's available within children's social care. Who is available across statutory and voluntary adult services that can input into this couple to help them work towards perhaps being able to parent again and parent successfully.
And it's interesting you picked up around parents who are serious offenders. Again, we don't need to go into details today. If anybody wants to look at the details behind Victoria Martin's death, it's out there in the public domain. But you mentioned at the start, particularly in relation to Victoria's father, there were previous criminal convictions. There were services involved around that because of some quite serious offences that had taken place. And I know the review itself talks quite frankly about managing risks where a parent or carer is a serious offender. And we talked about sort of specialist services there, which is really important. But I think In terms of the learning here for professionals who might not see themselves as child protection specialists, specifically working with children, are there any kind of key messages for those agencies like probation, for example, who might be quite adult focused?
I think if you're working in one of those agencies and you know that you're working with a serious offender, it's about taking time to stop and think about what contact this person might be having with children. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're living in a home with children. It could also mean that they're either visiting homes or visiting places where children are. And not to underestimate that risk, but to make sure that you understand it. So always refer it on to children's social care. And if you are working as a practitioner in children's social care and you're on the end of that referral in, that you think about what expertise that you already have within the partnership or that you need to have to be able to make a fully informed risk assessment. And I think I've already mentioned not just relying on what the offender tells you. There is a case within the review where a man entered a new relationship and had 2 children without telling his probation officer. So really getting underneath and checking in with other agencies about what they know. And it's really important to be as curious as you can be and triangulate all of that information.
And we often talk about professional curiosity and like you say, a lot of it is just about just asking those questions or just checking these things out. And I think the other key thing with that is obviously, the updated information sharing guidance that came out in 2024, just trying to get rid of those barriers around information sharing that came up when GDPR came in and everybody got very worried about talking to anybody about anything really in case they breached GDPR. And again, it's so important that people are aware around the information sharing guidance. And in a nutshell, for anybody listening to this, if you have a safeguarding concern for a child, GDPR does not get in the way of information sharing. And it's very, very clear we should be seeking and sharing information. So it's not just about being passive and expecting somebody to share something with you. Like say, Sally, a lot of it is about just picking up the phone and just saying, I just want to check this out. Any concerns you have there, anything like that, because often we do all hold a little piece of the jigsaw and sometimes just joining up those dots can be absolutely crucial. So again, if anybody's not familiar with the information sharing guidance, have a look on the SSCP website. We've got loads and loads of information there about it. We've got an animation. We've got another previous podcast that we did around information sharing as well. So it's so important you are aware of that. Sally, if it's all right, I think one of the main the last things I really wanted to pick up on, when you talked about the themes earlier, are about families who frequently move between areas. And this is something that features obviously very, very strongly in this report. As you mentioned earlier, that does create some real difficulties when we talk about cross-border sort of working or making sure that children don't fall through the gaps. So on a national perspective then, what do you feel needs to kind of change to stop, I guess not just vulnerable babies, but children as a whole falling through the gaps when families do sort of frequently move areas or cross borders?
Yeah, when we looked at this, and again, as you say, this isn't just for babies, this is across all of the rapid reviews that we receive. We see 3 key areas where things go wrong. And the first one is that transfers of information are poorly conducted. So they might be done by email or a quick telephone conversation. There's not a lot of documentation around the history. And the thing is, if you're doing all of this quickly by email, you might lose some of the nuance around a family. The second area where it goes wrong is where the information that's being transferred between local authorities is either delayed or incomplete. And what that means is if a new issue arises in that area, or if that area is trying to get to grips with the existing issue, they might make some decisions that might be the wrong decisions because they haven't got the complete amount of information. So, for example, they might have the police and children's social care information, but there's some really vital elements of health information that are missing. And the third area where it goes wrong is where there is some unclear understanding of which local authority is taking responsibility for a child and family. We all know in working together, it's absolutely crystal clear that responsibility sits with the local authority where the child resides. But very often with these families, they're hopping across geographical boundaries. As I mentioned earlier, they move in with the mum's sister, then the next week they're with the gran, then they go to the paternal grandparents. And so some sort of decision very often needs to be made about whether you're going to keep changing which local authority has got responsibility or whether that's just going to sit with one local authority. And also sort of aligned to that, that's particularly important where there's an existing care order in place, particularly where there's big geographical distances. So if you've got a care order that's designated to one local authority, the family have moved 200 miles away, it's not terribly practical for the previous local authority to be doing all of that oversight. But then it's really unclear who is doing what because it's been inappropriately documented. So having information that's up and ready to go if a family move, making sure that those handover processes are really robust, having telephone conversations or video calls to make sure that that's fully understood and having that ability to be able to then ask questions and making sure that as a local authority, you've got a very clear protocol on how to do a proper handover. They are really important messages. So I think we did make some recommendations in the review. And I suppose your question is around what needs to happen nationally. So we've made some recommendations, particularly for the next iteration of working together. One of those is that where a child is on a child in need plan or a child protection plan and they move between local authority areas, there needs to be a robust and formalised and minuted process in place to transfer that information with all agencies present. It's not just one agency handing over to one agency. It's 3 statutory agencies plus education, if relevant, handing over to 3 statutory agencies and education in the new area. And then the second thing is that we've asked working together to set out the principles that local authorities need to have in their protocols that they then follow where there's a lack of clarity over who is responsible for the safeguarding of a child and family.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sally. And yeah, like I say, so important. We see it time and time again. And as you mentioned, if a child is on a child protection plan, there are some quite clear timescales and agreements and cross-border arrangements in place. But I think importantly, as you've picked up on there, that's quite often about children's services liaising and communicating with each other and agreeing, sort of transferring. And that's fairly sort of black and white. But that involvement of wider partnership agencies being so crucial. But that is just for children on child protection plans. And as you mentioned, it doesn't include children on child in need plans, for example. There's nothing sort of formally structured in place. So I think that inclusion would be very much welcome to make sure that everybody is on the same page with these things. When, particularly, like say, when somebody is moving frequently or moving long distances, but it's very uncertain what's happening with that. Having those clear protocols in place is really key, isn't it? Sally, I'm gonna ask you a quite a difficult question here because I think the review is really comprehensive and there's a lot in there to pick out, I think, and we've kind of highlighted those key themes. But I guess I'm going to ask you a tricky question, which is if you're a kind of professional working with families, if you're a midwife or a health visitor or a police officer or housing worker or social worker sort of listening to this, if you could kind of boil it down to kind of one kind of key takeaway from this review and sort of changes in their practice, and what would you hope that would be? That is a big question. I appreciate because there's a lot within this, but are you able to do that? I don't know.
I think we've talked a lot about professional curiosity, haven't we? It just struck me when we were having this conversation. We keep coming back to that. I think there's something about, as a practitioner, not taking what you see, hear, or what you actually sense, what you feel at face value, and just stepping back, taking a bit of time to think, and then triangulating all of the information that you do get. And then I suppose just on the back of that, I was reflecting after the panel meeting the other day, how reliant as practitioners we've become on electronic communication. And that's obviously because I absolutely get that people are incredibly busy and meeting themselves coming back, and there's incredible time pressures and workforce challenges. But we have got very dependent on doing things by email, or many services have this electronic tasking system where you can just log onto your tablet and task somebody to do something. And have we lost the value of having a conversation? So when you're in a difficult situation and you're not quite sure what to do, just stepping back, thinking, who would be able to help me understand this situation better? And would a conversation rather than an electronic message help me?
It is a difficult balance, isn't it? I think we're all trying to strike. And, with online life, there's huge benefits that it brings. Absolutely. But I think it's an important point you raised. We do lose, I think, that personal touch, that developing professional working relationships better. But also, I think that more frequent, somebody coined a phrase the other day, or used a phrase, sort of micro engagements with people, those kind of quick conversations or just short conversations, which could be key. And it feels now, sadly, like we have to make that extra effort to actually talk to somebody directly, face to face, spend time with people. Yeah, I think it's so important we do that. And certainly, we're just for reference, we're planning our next conference for later on in this year. And actually, that's quite a big part of that is actually making sure we've got those good working relationships and understanding between each other in amongst the time of change and development, with working together coming in, the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill going through, Parliament as we speak, with Families First coming in. It's, for me and for us as a business unit, it feels more important than ever that we all come together collectively as kind of agencies, as one agency, ideally, to support families and keep children safe, to be able to move forward in the future. And I think you're right. If we're doing everything online, emails are not a good form of communication, but we tend to rely on it, don't we, on day to day. But the more we can kind of build in those good interactions, I think, between agencies, the better. Mm. Sally, thank you so much. That was really interesting to go through with you, and I think so key. And as I mentioned, for anybody that's not read the review, obviously we've given some highlights here, but there is a lot within that review, and I would really strongly recommend reading it. I'll post a link, obviously, in the chat for it there. But hopefully that's given you a bit of insight into some of the key points from it. So, Sally, thank you so much for coming along today, or undertaking the review in the first place, and all the work that the panel do. But importantly, sort of coming in to give us a bit of an overview. It's always really, really appreciated.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Steve, and thanks to you and everybody at the partnership for the amazing work that they do.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Sally. Thanks for coming back and joining us again. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and no doubt we will speak again at some point shortly.
Bye.
As always, if you'd like to find out more details on the topics discussed in today's episode, please go to the SSCP website at somersetsafeguardingchildren.org.uk, or you can go to the National Child Safeguarding Practice Review's brand new website, which is childsafeguarding.independent-panel.uk. Or, to make life easy, just follow any of the links in this episode description. Now, if you enjoy listening to P-Pod, we would really appreciate it if you did take that bit of time to follow or subscribe to us on your chosen platform. Or even better, leave us a review to let other people know about it, and make sure to let your colleagues know about this podcast and encourage them to come and join us here as well. It really does help to spread the word. Now, if you have any questions or comments arising from today's episode, or would like to be involved in future episodes, we would love you to get in touch with us at thepod@somerset.gov.uk. Once again, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my guest today, friend of the P-Pod, Sally Shearer OBE from the National Panel. And as always, I'd like to thank you for listening. My name is Steve Maccabee, and I'm the Training Manager for the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. And I look forward to you joining us again next time at the P-Pod.
Let's work together to help keep children safe.